Chapter 14 of Patricia Brent, Spinster. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anna Simon. Patricia Brent, Spinster, by Herbert Jenkins. Chapter 14. Galvin House meets a lord. The effect of the Morning Post announcement upon Galvin House had been little short of sensational. Although all were aware of the engagement, to see the announcement in print seemed to arouse them to a point of enthusiasm. Everyone, from the servants upwards, possessed a copy of the Morning Post, with the single exception of Mrs. Barnes, who had mislaid hers, and made everybody's life a misery by insisting on examining their copy to make quite sure that they had not taken hers by mistake. Had not Patricia been so preoccupied, she could not have failed to notice the atmosphere of suppressed excitement at Galvin House. Many glances were directed at her, glances of superior knowledge, of which she was entirely unconscious. Womanlike, she never paused to ask herself what she really felt or what she really meant. Her thoughts ran in a circle, coming back inevitably to the maddening question, "What does he really think of me?" Why had fate been so unkind as to undermine a possible friendship with that damning introduction? After all, she would ask herself indifferently, what did it matter? Bowen was nothing to her. Then back again her thoughts would rush to the inevitable question, what did he really think? Since the night of her adventure, Patricia had formed the habit of dressing for dinner. She made neither excuse nor explanation to herself as to why she did so. Miss Wangle and Mrs. Mosscrop Smythe, however, had covertly remarked upon the fact, but Patricia had ignored them. She had reached that state in her psychological development when she neither explained nor denied things. With delicacy and insight, Providence has withheld from woman the uncomfortable quality of introspection. Had Patricia subjected her actions to the rigid test of reason, she would have found them strangely at variance with her determination. With a perversity characteristic of her sex, she forbade Bowen to see her, and then spent hours in speculating as to when and how he would disobey her. A parcel in the hall at Galvin House sent the colour flooding to her cheeks, whilst Gustave, entering the lounge, bearing his flamboyant nickel-plated apology for the conventional silver salver, set her heart thumping with expectation. As the day on which Bowen was to dine at Galvin House drew near, the excitement became intense, developing into a panic when the day itself dawned. All were wondering how this or that garment would turn out when actually worn, and those who were not in difficulties with their clothes were troubled about their manners. At Galvin House, manners were things that were worn, like a gardenia or a patent hook and eye. Patricia had once explained to an uncomprehending Aunt Adelaide that Galvin House had more manners than breeding. On the Friday evening, when Patricia returned to Galvin House, Gustave was in the hall. "Oh, miss!" he involuntarily exclaimed. Patricia waited for more, but after a moment of hesitation, Gustave disappeared along the hall as if there were nothing strange in his conduct, leaving Patricia staring after him in surprise. At that moment Mrs. Craske Morton bustled out of the lounge, full of an unwonted importance. "Oh, Miss Brent!" she exclaimed. "I am so glad you've come. I have a few friends coming to dinner this evening, and we are dressing." Without waiting for a reply, Mrs. Craske Morton returned and disappeared along the passage leading to the servants' regions. At that moment Mr. Bolton appeared at the top of the stairs in his shirt sleeves, but at the sight of Patricia he turned and bolted precipitately out of sight. Patricia walked slowly upstairs and along the corridor to her room, unconscious that each door she passed was closed upon a tragedy. In one room Mrs. Barnes sat on her bed in an agony of indecision and a camisole, wondering how the seams of her only evening frock could be made black with the blue-black ink that had been given her at the stationer's shop in error. Mr. James Harris, a little bearded man with long legs and a short body, stood in front of his glass, frankly baffled by the problem of how to keep the top of his trousers from showing above the opening of his low-cut evening waistcoat, an abandoned garment that seemed determined to show all that it was supposed to hide. Miss Sikkum was engaged in a losing game with delicacy. On her lap lay the Brixton Paris model blouse, which she had adorned with narrow black velvet ribbon. Should she or should she not enlarge the surface of exposure? If she did, Miss Wangle might think her fast. If she did not, Lord Peter might think her suburban. Mr. Sefton was at work upon his back hair, striving to remove from his reflection in the glass a likeness to a sandy cockatoo. Mr. Cordal was vainly struggling with a voluminous starched shirt, which, as he bent, seemed determined to give him the appearance of a pouter pigeon. To each his tragedy, and to all their anguish. Even Miss Wangle had her problem. Should she or should she not remove the lace from the modest V in her black silk evening gown? The thought of the bishop, however, proved too much for her, and her collar bones continued to remain a mystery to Galvin House. The dinner gong found everyone anxious and unprepared. All had a vision of Bowen sitting in judgment upon them and mentally comparing Galvin House with Park Lane, for in Bayswater Park Lane is the pinnacle of culture and social splendour. A few minutes after the last strain of the gong, pounded by Gustave in a manner worthy of the occasion, had subsided, Miss Sikkum crept out from her room feeling very undressed. The sight of Mr. Sefton nearly drove her back precipitately to the maiden fastness of her chamber. Was she really too undressed? She asked herself. Slowly the guests descended, each anxious to cede to others the pride of place, all absorbed with his or her particular tragedy. By the aid of pins, Mr. Caudle had overcome his likeness to a pigeon, but he had not allowed for movement, which tore the pins from their hold, allowing his shirt front to balloon out joyfully before him, for the rest of the evening obscuring his boots. Miss Wangle looked at Miss Sikkum and mentally thanked heaven and the bishop that she had restrained her abandoned impulse to remove the black lace from her own neck. Mr. Bolton's attention was concentrated upon the centre stud of his shirt. The buttonhole was too large, and the head of the stud insisted on disappearing in a most coquettish and embarrassing manner. Mr. Bolton was not sure that Bowen would approve of blue underwear, and consequently kept a finger and thumb upon his stud for the greater part of the evening. As each entered the lounge, it was with a hurried glance round to see if the guest of the evening had arrived, followed by a sigh of relief on discovering that he had not. Mrs. Craske Morton had taken the precaution of deferring the dinner until 8 o'clock. She wished Bowen's entry to be dramatic. Mrs. Craske Morton had asked a few friends of her own to meet her distinguished guest, a Miss Plimsoll, who was composed in claret colour and royal blue trimming, and Mr. and Mrs. Samuel Ragbone. Mrs. Ragbone was a stout, jolly woman with a pronounced Cockney accent. Mr. Ragbone was a man whose eyebrows seemed to rise higher with each year, and whose manner of patient suffering became more pathetically unreal with the passage of each season. Mrs. Craske Morton always explained him as a solicitor. Morton, Gophrim and Bowett, of Lincoln's Inn, knew him as their chief clerk. The atmosphere of the lounge was one of nervous tension. All were listening for the bell which would announce the arrival of Bowen. When at last he came, everybody was taken by surprise. Mr. Bolton's stud eluded his grasp, Mr. Sefton felt his back hair, whilst Miss Sikkum blushed rosily at her own daring. A dead silence spread over the company, broken by Gustave, who, throwing open the door with a flourish, announced, "Lieutenant Colonel Lord Peter Bowen, D.S.O." Bowen gave him a quick glance with widened eyes, then, coming forward, shook hands with Mrs. Craske Morton. Miss Sikkum was disappointed to find that he was in khaki. She had a vague idea that the nobility adopted different evening clothes from the ordinary rank and file. It would have pleased her to see Bowen with velvet stripes down his trousers, a velvet collar and velvet cuffs. A coloured silk waistcoat would have convinced her. Mrs. Craske Morton was determined to do her work thoroughly. She had taken the precaution of telling Patricia that dinner would not be served until a few minutes after 8. That would give her time to introduce Bowen to all the guests. She proceeded to conduct him round to everyone in turn. In her flurry she quite forgot the careful schooling to which she had subjected herself for a week past, and she introduced Miss Wangle to Bowen. "Lord Peter, allow me to introduce Miss Wangle. Miss Wangle, Lord Peter Bowen." And this was the form adopted with the rest of the company. Bowen's sixth bow had just been interrupted by Mr. Caudle grasping him warmly by the hand when Patricia entered. For a moment she looked about her, regarding the strange toilette. Then she saw Bowen. She felt herself crimsoning as he slipped away from Mr. Caudle's grasp and came across to her. All the guests hung back as if this were the meeting between Wellington and Blücher. "I've done 6. There are about 20 more to do. If you save me, Patricia, I'll forgive you anything after we're married." Patricia shook hands sedately. Mrs. Craske Morton bustled up to reclaim Bowen. "A little surprise, Miss Brent. I hope you will forgive me." Patricia smiled at her in anything but a forgiving spirit. "And now, Lord Peter, I want to introduce you to—" "Dinner is served, madame." Gustave was certainly doing the thing in style. At a sign from Mrs. Craske Morton, Miss Wangle secured Mr. Samuel Ragbone, and they started for the dining room. The remainder of the guests paired off in accordance with Mrs. Craske Morton's instructions, written and verbal, she left nothing to chance, and the procession was brought up by Mrs. Craske Morton herself and Bowen. Patricia fell to the lot of Mr. Sefton. As soon as the guests were seated, a death-like stillness reigned. Bowen was looking round with interest as he unfolded his napkin into which had been deftly inserted